Looking at ancient ice under a microscope is like staring back in time. Ice cores shed light on events in human history because they contain samples of what was in the air and water back then. But when scientists analyzed eons-old ice taken from Mount Kilimanjaro, they found something entirely unexpected. Inside the giant frozen blocks were fragments that could be evidence to support a well-known Bible passage. And it could turn what we know about the Holy Book on its head. When scientists drilled into Mount Kilimanjaro, they found a biblical message within the ice. How can this be? Well, scientists extract the cores by drilling into glaciers and ice sheets either by hand or with special machinery. They can grab ice from more than 2 miles beneath the surface, too. So elements of that ice may have been on the planet for as long as 800,000 years. Many ice fields and glaciers have been formed over millennia. And as each layer of ice is added, it creates a record of the climate during that time. For example, water may contain bubbles of air that come from the period in which it froze. These findings can then be examined in a lab to gather crucial information, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, say. So ice cores can provide key info about the conditions on our planet. And that's not all. In some cases, the cores can also help us understand events in human history we don't know much about. Sometimes, they even seem to suggest that stories such as those in the Bible actually do have some basis in fact. And those ice cores from Mount Kilimanjaro did indeed appear to link to a story from the Old Testament. It's really quite extraordinary, and it has a lot to do with Kilimanjaro itself. This tale takes us back many millions of years to a time before humans had evolved in Africa. As you may know, Mount Kilimanjaro is in Tanzania's Kilimanjaro National Park. Geography buffs will tell you, too, that the United Republic of Tanzania, to give the country its proper name, is located in East Africa. Kilimanjaro National Park sits near Tanzania's northern border with Kenya, and it covers a whopping 652 square miles. Pretty impressive, right? That sprawling land plays home to a group of indigenous people, the Bantu-speaking Chaga. They migrated to the area from about the 11th century, and their economy is largely based on agriculture. In fact, the Chaga's Arabica coffee beans are exported around the world. You may have even had some in your cup of joe this morning. The Chaga are certainly not alone in the park, as it also hosts a wide variety of wildlife. The slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro are home to the tree hyrax, a nocturnal mammal that is a distant relative of the elephant. Blue monkeys, western black and white colobuses, and Cape buffaloes have all taken up residence in Kilimanjaro National Park, too. But what about the ice? Well, Mount Kilimanjaro consists of 3 peaks, all of which have been formed from currently inactive volcanoes. You've got Kibo, which has a summit 16,893 feet above sea level. Then there's Moenzi, which rises to 16,893 feet, and Shira, with a summit 13,140 feet above sea level. Of the 3, only Kibo could potentially erupt in the future. Shira's life as an active volcano started around 2.5 million years ago, and this explosive period lasted for some 600,000 years. Today, though, Shira has a large plateau that is surrounded by the remnants of its caldera, or the edge typical of a volcanic mountain. This caldera has been much reduced over the millennia as the result of erosion. The volcanic activity from Kibo and Moenzi was much more recent, taking place about 1 million years ago. And, as it happens, Moenzi and Kibo also have a plateau between them known as the Saddle, at an altitude of about 14,400 feet. All of Kilimanjaro's rugged peaks have intriguing features, too. They include secondary summits, pinnacles, and ridges that have been created through the eroding action of wind and rain. The environment around the dormant volcano is pretty verdant to boot. About 1,000 square miles of the land around the mountains are forested, although the Kilimanjaro foothills are cultivated by local farmers. There, they harvest a selection of crops, including beans, sunflowers, maize, and wheat. The coffee mentioned earlier grows a little higher up the slopes at an altitude of around 3,000 to 6,000 feet. As for the highest of the 3 Kilimanjaro peaks? Well, it appears that Kibo last erupted between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Evidence for this comes in the form of fumaroles breaches in the rock surface that still give off gases. Kaibo's caldera, meanwhile, is a little over 1.5 miles across and includes the Riush crater. This feature was named after mountaineer Gustav Riush following his 25th climb to the mountain's summit. Of course, for East African people, Mount Kilimanjaro has been a familiar landmark for thousands of years. But it was only as recently as 1848 that modern Europeans first got a close-up view of the majestic ice-covered peaks. And the lucky men in question were two German missionaries, Johann Krapf and Johannes Rebmann. On May 11, 1848, Rebmann wrote an entry in his diary that documented what he and Krapf had seen. According to Hans Meyer's 1891 book Across East African Glaciers, an account of the first ascent of Kilimanjaro, the explorer explained, "This morning, at 10 o'clock, we obtained a clearer view of the mountains of Jaga, the summit of one of which was covered by what looked like a beautiful white cloud." Jaga was an alternative name for Mount Kilimanjaro at the time. Rebmann's diary entry continued, "When I inquired as to the dazzling whiteness, the guide merely called it cold, and at once I knew it could be neither more nor less than snow. Immediately, I understood how to interpret the marvelous tales Dr. Krapf and I had heard at the coast of a vast mountain of gold and silver in the far interior, the approach to which was guarded by evil spirits. Then, once Europeans had managed to reach Kilimanjaro, there were several unsuccessful attempts to climb to Kaibo's peak. Finally, in 1889, Hans Meyer and Ludwig Percheler made it to Kaibo's summit, which is on the south side of the mountain's crater. Meyer, a German geographer who wrote that book about Kilimanjaro, had attempted Kaibo twice before but had failed on both occasions. At the age of 31, however, he finally succeeded along with his Austrian mountaineer companion. The two had reached the summit thanks to a carefully planned system of well-supplied base camps. But it would be nearly another 25 years before any European reached the summit of Moenzi. That technically more arduous climb was conquered in the end by Germans Fritz Kloot and Edward Eller in 1912. And, of course, ever since those milestones were achieved, people from all around the world have flocked to Kilimanjaro to trek up its slopes. As many as 25,000 visit the mountain each year, in fact. At well over 19,000 feet, Mount Kilimanjaro is Africa's tallest peak. It's also the highest freestanding mountain anywhere in the world. Naturally, that height is the reason why it features snow cover and glaciers, even though it is in the tropics and relatively close to the equator. Extraordinarily, though, analysis of the dust found in ice cores taken from this snowy peak would seemingly support a story in Genesis, one about a 300-year drought. Yes, there is ice there, as nighttime temperatures on Kilimanjaro's slopes and summit can fall to as low as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite this, though, snow cover and glaciers on top of the mountain have been shrinking. And while this phenomenon occurred for most of the 20th century, melting was recorded from 1912 to 1953, for instance, it's only continued at a faster pace since then. Scientists view the ice melt on Kilimanjaro as part of a wider global trend of glacial retreat. Some even believe the material will have disappeared entirely from the mountain by 2060. But while this has all been linked to climate change, there may also be other environmental factors at work, deforestation, for instance. In any case, researchers drilled 6 cores from Kilimanjaro's ice to help determine the causes of the mountain's disappearing frozen water reserves. In 2000, a team led by Ohio State University geologist Lonnie Thompson camped for about a month on the slopes of Kilimanjaro to retrieve the cores. Getting the required samples was hardly easy, either. For one, the operation led by Thompson needed no fewer than 25 different permissions from Tanzanian agencies. Then, after the team were finally given the green light, they still had to get their equipment up the mountain to the drilling site. That was a task that ultimately entailed at least 92 porters. When the holes were finally drilled, however, the ice cores extracted varied from 30 to almost 170 feet in length. Then, 2 years after the cores had been obtained, Thompson and several of his colleagues published a paper that was based on analysis of the ice samples. This was titled Kilimanjaro Ice Core Records: Evidence of Holocene Climate Change in Tropical Africa. As the name of that paper suggests, the reason why Thompson and his fellow scientists had traveled up Kilimanjaro was to study the impact of climate change on those high ice fields. But there was yet another find along the way. Ultimately, you see, the group drew parallels between their finds and the Book of Genesis. The dating methods the scientists used were pretty incredible. There was even a link to 1950s nuclear bomb tests. You see, those tests released an isotope called chlorine-36. Then, once this radioactive material was detected in the cores, it could be used as a marker to help investigate the whole history of the ice cylinders. And upon investigation, the cores offered evidence of a drought in Africa, one that had started about 8,300 years ago and lasted for some 500 years. Thompson explained this discovery further in an Ohio State University press release, saying, "We believe that this represents a time when the lakes of Africa were drying up." The ice also showed a later drought that took place around 5,200 years ago. But it was a third drought from about 4,000 years ago that seemingly tied in with the story of Joseph as recorded in the Book of Genesis. That tale is not only found in the Christian Bible, but also the Islamic Quran and the Jewish Torah. As you may know, these reported events of Joseph's life are recounted in chapters 37 to 50 of Genesis. The Bible claims that Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, who had been born when his father was married to his second wife Rachel. It seems, too, that he was a particular favorite of his dad's. The story goes that Jacob gave Joseph a coat of many colors as a means of showing his affection. But apparently this gift, with its clear connotations of favoritism, made Joseph's brothers envious. And as Genesis says, the mystical dreams Joseph claimed to have, as well as his reported ability to interpret them, only made the rivalry worse. The Bible claims that the brothers seized Joseph in a fit of envy. Some of Joseph's siblings are said to have wanted to murder him, but instead he was supposedly sold into slavery to a band of traders whose camel train was on its way to Egypt. And to conceal their crime from Jacob, the brothers reportedly smeared Joseph's coat with goat's blood and presented it as evidence that he had died. So, as the story goes, Joseph began life in a foreign land as a house slave to a rich Egyptian called Potiphar. Unfortunately, Potiphar's wife Zuleika took a shine to Joseph and made her feelings known. And while Joseph is said to have rebuffed those advances, his reward for loyalty to his master was to be thrown into prison. Zuleika had laid false rape charges against him. The Book of Genesis also says that Joseph showed his talent for interpreting the dreams of others when he was locked up. In fact, he actually performed that service for two of his fellow prisoners. These men were no ordinary criminals, either. One had been the Egyptian pharaoh's chief baker, while the other had worked as the ruler's cup-bearer. Joseph's translation of the cup-bearer's dream was that he would be restored to his previous position. The baker, on the other hand, would be executed. And as the Bible tells it, both prophecies ultimately proved correct. Then, a couple of years later, the pharaoh himself apparently had a strange dream. In this vision, he saw 7 emaciated cattle eating 7 well-fed cows. He also imagined 7 wilted ears of corn eating 7 healthy ears of grain. And although no one at court could tell their ruler what these disturbing scenes meant, the pharaoh's restored cup-bearer remembered Joseph's dream-interpreting talent. So, the biblical account claims that the pharaoh sent for Joseph. He explained that Egypt would enjoy 7 years of plenty, then 7 years of famine. And the pharaoh was reportedly so impressed by the former slave that he would appoint him to be his vizier, a senior advisor and official. As the story explains, Joseph then set about storing great quantities of grain during the 7 good years. In this way, when the 7 years of drought and famine came along just as had been predicted, these grain hordes were able to see Egypt through hard times. And it's this period of drought that may well tie in with the findings of Thompson and his team. You'll remember that the ice cores showed a drought had likely started in the area about 4,000 years ago and had lasted for some 3 centuries. More specifically, the evidence the scientists had uncovered for this barren period had been a thin layer of dust in the ice cores. And along with the account in Genesis, other ancient records indicate Egypt had been troubled by a drought so severe that it ultimately put the authority of the pharaohs at risk. Before then, parts of the Sahara Desert as we know it today had been fertile land. And this blend of biblical storytelling and modern scientific fact seems to further verify the tale of Joseph's drought prophecy. Yes, while few take the Old Testament as literal history, Thompson's Kilimanjaro ice cores appear to show that some actual facts could be woven into its tales. Then, over a decade after Thompson's discovery, experts in Israel unearthed a historical treasure that suggested yet another biblical story had really occurred. At Mount Zion in Jerusalem, a group of archaeologists slaved away in the Middle Eastern heat. And as the team went, they picked through thousands of years of history in a bid to find something significant. Their efforts weren't in vain, either, as ultimately they were rewarded with an incredible find, something that may just prove a story from the Bible actually once took place. It's perhaps no surprise that the archaeologists struck pay dirt, either, as in the 6th century BC, a great city one described in the Bible as a place rich in culture and wealth stood at the location. And even today, Jerusalem hosts many historic sites that provide a window into the area's past. But because many stories have been told about this land, it sometimes takes an expert to separate fact from fiction. According to the Bible, Jerusalem fell when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II unleashed his wrath on the Judean king Zedekiah in around 586 BC. And in the chaos, it's said, much of the city was destroyed. Even the mighty King Solomon's temple was apparently demolished, sparking an archaeological mystery that continues today. But how much of this legend actually has its basis in fact? Well, before answering that question, it's worth looking at exactly where the archaeologists' dig took place. Today, the name Mount Zion is used to refer to an area of Jerusalem known as the Western Hill. Situated in the vicinity of the old city's ancient walls, this mound is where many modern excavations take place. And according to some, Mount Zion is the site where the biblical King David constructed his palace. Jerusalem itself, meanwhile, was first inhabited in around 4500 BC and has seen many changes since, as a succession of invaders conquered its borders. But while history tells us the story of each population, the Bible gives a far more specific version of events. Apparently, the city was home to a community of Canaanite people in the 12th century BC, so before King David arrived. Then, according to the Bible, in around 1000 BC King David laid siege to Jerusalem and established his own city in its place. There, the leader built his fabled palace, and he declared that this new settlement would be the heart of the kingdom of Israel. Later, David's son King Solomon is said to have constructed his own grand temple on the same site. Nowadays, of course, Jerusalem is integral to many religions, not only Judaism, but also Christianity and Islam. As such, the city lies at the heart of the conflict that still rages in the Middle East. And because of this battle for sovereignty, some of the region's history has become confused. In fact, Western Hill is among 3 sites that have been identified as Mount Zion over the years. One of these locations, known as Temple Mount, has been largely off-limits to archaeologists in recent times. Both the Western and Lower Eastern Hills, by contrast, have been subjected to numerous excavations. You see, many believe that the Western Hill contains the true relics of the biblical city, despite evidence that suggests the Eastern Hill was actually once the location of David's settlement. Furthermore, today's Mount Zion has been a hotbed of excavations since at least the 19th century. And in 2007 the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, UNCC, launched its own Mount Zion Archaeological project, the first scheme of its kind by an institution from outside Israel. Since then, each summer season has yielded fascinating finds that help to tell the story of this ancient city. In 2016, for example, UNCC archaeologists unearthed an ancient coin at Mount Zion that is thought to hark back to 56 AD, featuring the face of Emperor Nero. The discovery seemingly proved that the Romans had been in Jerusalem some 14 years before they sacked the city. According to researchers, the coin had also likely made its way into one of the wealthy Jewish homes that once existed there. But this is far from the only significant find that the UNCC team have made at Mount Zion. During one season, the archaeologists uncovered a cup forged from stone that had been inscribed with Hebraic letters. Sensationally, the script on the item was the same as that on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Elsewhere, the group also excavated part of a gate that is said to date back to the time of the Crusades. Then, on August 11, 2019, the project's members had an exciting announcement. While excavating at Mount Zion, they had made a string of discoveries linked to the time of the First Crusade. Beginning in 1095, this turbulent period saw Christian armies descend on Jerusalem in an attempt to reclaim the region. Before the First Crusade, the Holy Land had been under Islamic control since around the 7th century AD. But after 4 bloody years, the Christians ultimately wrestled control of the region and took Jerusalem in 1099. And in modern-day Mount Zion, archaeologists discovered evidence that gave them a fascinating insight into how this 11th century skirmish had played out. Historically, one account of the siege claimed that the Crusaders were initially foiled by a low ditch around the city. When one military leader pledged gold coins to any soldier who would help block the ditch with stones, though, he had several takers. And although this story is often dismissed as fiction, archaeologists at Mount Zion discovered what they believed to be reliable proof of the tale's veracity. For one, the group found a filled-in ditch that seemingly matched the one in the legend. Intriguingly, an ornate piece of jewelry was also unearthed at the location, with the item believed to have belonged to one of the Fatimid Muslims who defended Jerusalem against the Crusaders. And because the trinket was found amongst Christian artifacts, archaeologists are certain that both it and the ditch are relics of the 1099 siege. Yet these were far from the most important discoveries made at Mount Zion during 2019's summer season. On the same day, the team announced another incredible find. While excavating the western hill, they had uncovered another stunning piece of jewelry that may go on to shed new light on a turbulent period in the history of Jerusalem. What's more, the artifact appears to date back to 1,700 years before the time of the First Crusade. Crafted from gold and silver, the piece, a tassel or earring, was obviously of great beauty and value at the time. The decorative treasure features a bell-like upper section, as well as a lower part modeled on a bunch of grapes. And even though the item has warped and distorted over time, it remains stunning. Interestingly, though, the jewelry wasn't the only thing that the dig site revealed. According to UNCC, archaeologists also discovered significant deposits of ash, as well as household items, such as lamps and pieces of pottery. Several arrowheads were also uncovered in the same area. And, together, these artifacts allowed experts to date the site to around 586 BC, a significant point in the story of Jerusalem. Crucially, at that time, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to the city, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. According to the Bible, Jerusalem was wealthy during the reign of King Zedekiah, who had previously been put into power by Nebuchadnezzar himself. However, when Zedekiah defied his patron and allied himself with Egypt, the Babylonian launched a siege against the city. And this wasn't a fight that would be won overnight. As the biblical story goes, in fact, the siege lasted for many months, perhaps even longer than 2 years. And as a result of the skirmish, Jerusalem's citizens experienced many hardships. Then once Nebuchadnezzar finally conquered the city, much of it was razed to the ground, including Solomon's mighty temple. Ultimately, Zedekiah was also captured and imprisoned in Babylon, but not before having his eyes cut out. In the Bible, moreover, these events are covered in the second book of Kings. The passage reads, "So the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled by night, by the way of the gate between the 2 walls." But how much of this tale is based on true events? Well, today, there are 2 different schools of thought when it comes to interpreting the history of Jerusalem. In short, minimalists want clear, independent evidence that what was recorded actually came to pass, while maximalists seek to use archaeology to support what is written in scripture. And according to some, this latest discovery is a win for those on the maximalist side of the spectrum. It's said, for instance, that the artifacts found at Mount Zion specifically point to a period of violence just like that depicted in the Bible. Here we captured a moment in time, an event in an exact year, with everything that comes with destruction: ash, complete vessels, Scythian arrows. Dr. Rafi Lewis from Israel's Ashkelon Academic College told Haaretz in August 2019. UNCC professor Shimon Gibson also explained the context of the ancient finds when talking to the newspaper. For archaeologists, an ashen layer can mean a number of different things, he said. It could be ashy deposits removed from ovens, or it could be localized burning of garbage. However, in this case, the combination of an ashy layer full of artifacts mixed with arrowheads and a very special ornament indicates some kind of devastation and destruction. Nobody abandons gold jewelry, and nobody has arrowheads in their domestic refuse. Furthermore, the jewelry appears to confirm that Jerusalem was once home to affluent residents before Nebuchadnezzar's siege, just as scripture claims. Lewis explained, the biblical books of Kings and Daniel dwell on the wealth of Jerusalem that Nebuchadnezzar took back to Babylon and describe feasting using the gold vessels and copper vessels which came from the city. All in all, then, Lewis claimed, this small artifact shows the potential of how rich Jerusalem really was. And, significantly, this is the first occasion on which such a treasure has been uncovered at the Western Hill. In addition, while jewelry was previously recovered from the Eastern Hill back in 1979, experts believed that the site would actually have been located outside of the city in Nebuchadnezzar II's time. By contrast, archaeologists are sure that what is now known as Mount Zion was indeed part of Jerusalem in 586 BC. In fact, the excavations also revealed the first evidence of an Iron Age structure on the Western Hill, and this led researchers to conclude that the city was much larger at the time of the siege than had previously been believed. We know where the ancient fortification line ran, so we know that we are within the city, Gibson told the Daily Mail in August 2019. We know that this is not some dumping area, but the southwestern neighborhood of the Iron Age city. During the 8th century BC, the urban area extended from the City of David area to the southeast and as far as the Western Hill where we are digging. What's more, the evidence supports the idea that Jerusalem was a thriving metropolis in 586 BC rather than an isolated village. And again, this echoes the city that is described in biblical legend, lending further credence to the Maximalist camp. According to Lewis, the population of Jerusalem was likely boosted by way of an influx of refugees coming from the north. But how did such a precious find survive for all those years? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, discoveries such as this are particularly unusual. Frankly, jewelry is a rare find at conflict sites because this is exactly the sort of thing that attackers will loot and later melt down, Gibson told the Daily Mail. Researchers even believe that the artifact may once have been part of a larger object. Regardless, Lewis pointed out that the conflict that tore through Jerusalem in the 6th century BC is evident by the condition of the piece. It's been through trauma itself and was smashed somehow, he said to Haaretz. Lewis added of the ornate item, the little silver cluster of grapes is almost detached from its golden case, as if the jewel had been violently torn from somebody. You can almost sense the violence on the artifact itself. But despite the turbulent history of the region, it's thought that the relic lay undisturbed in the ruins of the siege for thousands of years. Yet the artifact isn't the only Mount Zion find to have helped shed light on Jerusalem's past. Yes, according to UNCC researchers, the arrowheads found among the layer of ash were also of great historical significance. Forged from iron and bronze, the weapons were of a type commonly linked with the Scythian people. And as we'll find out, this trail leads straight to the Babylonians who ransacked Jerusalem in 586 BC. Scythian arrowheads have reportedly been found at conflict sites dating from between the 6th and 7th centuries BC. Crucially, though, these weapons are known to have been part of the Babylonians' arsenal. As a result, then, their discovery is seemingly yet more evidence that the area was once attacked by the kingdom ruled by Nebuchadnezzar II. And for the archaeologists behind the dig, the discovery of the cache of artifacts is a major result. It is very exciting to be able to excavate the material signature of any given historical event, and even more so regarding an important historical event, such as the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, Lewis told CNN in August 2019. For Gibson, meanwhile, the dig is a chance to get close to the story depicted in the Bible. I like to think that we are excavating inside one of the great man's houses mentioned in the second book of Kings 25:9, he explained to the Daily Mail. But what will happen next at the site where legend is fast becoming reality? Well, currently archaeologists are still sifting through the relics at Mount Zion. And while the team have yet to begin excavating the building linked to the discovered ash layer nearby, they hope to return in the summer of 2020 to learn more. With any luck, too, they may be able to flesh out the biblical story even further. Sadly, though, Nebuchadnezzar's siege was far from the last tragedy to plague Jerusalem. As well as the destruction brought by the Crusades, the city fell to the Romans in 70 AD. Today, the Jewish community commemorates these incidents by marking Tisha B'Av, a day of fasting held in July or August. But while Jerusalem's history is marred by conflict, the Mount Zion dig has been bringing people together. And UNCC's Diane Zablotsky has praised students' involvement in the excavation. Although they are from different backgrounds and study in different majors, she said, they shared a unique experience that left them with a deep appreciation of archaeology, the history of Jerusalem, and a broadened worldview. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.